Hello, and welcome to this special event from KQED and the team behind the podcast Sold Out, Rethinking Housing in America. My name is Erika Kelly, and I'm the senior editor of housing at KQED. And tonight, I'll be joined by two of my colleagues, Erin Baldassari and Molly Solomon, and a panel of guests who are all deeply involved in housing issues here in the Bay Area. And the question we're here to discuss is, can tech solve the Bay Area's housing crisis? A couple of years ago, tech companies started pledging billions of dollars to help chip away at our housing affordability crisis. And it wasn't brand new, but the size and the publicity around this new money was pretty remarkable. You started to see $1 billion from Google, a pledge of $2.5 billion from Apple, $1 billion from Facebook, and $500 million from the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, or CZI. And now wherever you look in Bay Area housing circles, from affordable housing builders to research groups to advocacy organizations, you see they're partnered with or getting funding from one or more of those places. And now, to be perfectly transparent, some of that money goes towards my salary. CZI helps fund KQED's coverage of housing issues. And so we wanted to ask the question, can tech, with all that money, help solve the housing crisis? And now, well, they can help, but now the question is whether they can really solve it. The answer is no. Housing is a really thorny problem. And when you understand how expensive and how difficult it is to build in California, you start to see that $5 billion really isn't that much. But tonight, we'll talk to a group of people who are involved in this effort and ask, where are the investments from the tech companies going? Are we seeing signs of success? And beyond that, what should the role be of tech companies in addressing this crisis that we all live with? But for the first part of tonight, I want to introduce Erin Baldassari and Molly Solomon to set us up, to give us an idea of where we are in this housing crisis. Molly and Erin are housing reporters and the hosts of KQED's podcast, Sold Out, Rethinking Housing in America. And right before we hear from them, I'm going to play a short clip from the podcast.
We can't go back to housing as usual.
So in this series, we're looking at solutions, ideas that might help us chip away at the crisis and make housing more affordable. There won't be any silver bullets,
as so many people told us along the way.
But what we will do is talk about a few places to begin.
Like a way to cut down on the crazy high cost of building in California.
Or how housing could be the starting point for reparations.
But first, we're going to look at homelessness, a problem that really has no easy solution. Join us for Sold Out, Rethinking Housing in America. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
And and please do subscribe to Sold Out if you haven't heard it yet. And Molly, I want to ask you the first question. As you did the reporting for the podcast, what stuck out for you? A story or a statistic that really embodies the Bay Area's housing problems and how they're affecting people?
Yeah, thanks so much, Erika. And this is fun. Thanks to everybody that's watching and listening, and for everyone who's been a part of this panel tonight. We're excited. I think, I moved away for a while. I went to college, and then I went and lived in other places, in other states, and coming back to the Bay Area recently for this job and to report on housing and homelessness, like that, the sheer number of people who now live on the streets, in shelters, in their cars, I think is the first thing that really confronted me as a housing reporter. It's probably the most visible and the most obvious result of the crisis that we're all living here. And it's really hard to ignore. I mean, 150,000 people without permanent shelter, still that is a startling number. It was a startling number to kind of dig into for this podcast, but I mean, you think about it, that's more than the population of cities in the Bay Area. It's more people than live in Berkeley. So I think that, thinking about that was top of mind when we went into especially the first episode of thinking about, what would make it possible to not necessarily solve homelessness, but to start to chip away at it in a more significant way. Throughout our reporting in that episode and in previous stories that we've dug into about affordability and people who are kind of precariously on the edge of housing, you really start to think about and see the effects that has on people. One of the people we interviewed in Sold Out Margot Kuchel. She is a doctor at UCSF, and she's done a lot of the research looking at housing and just how being homeless can really age you. We found that when we spoke to people who are living in encampments in the Bay Area, it's little things can become big things, and just the impact of being housed, like what that has on your health. I think that just really, has stayed with me when I think about some of the work that we've done, especially one of the quotes that Margot had for us. She talked about being a doctor, being a physician, and that really the most of the work that she does now is touching housing, and that, for her, there is, no medicine that is more powerful than housing when it comes to homelessness. So, I think that kind of says it all in terms of the impact that housing someone can have.
Thanks, Molly. And Erin, same question for you. What really stuck out for you as like one of the biggest problems you saw, or what embodied that?
I think if you talk to any of the experts, they all agree that we've massively underproduced housing for the amount of people who are now living in the Bay Area. And you see that in not only the affordability, but in the long commutes and people coming from Tracy and even, Yolo County up as far as like Sacramento or beyond, and in the traffic that's created, although you don't feel that now during the pandemic. But housing affordability was a crisis before the pandemic. We know that the pandemic is going to make that worse. And, look, even before we had this pandemic, a recent report from Spur, that's a urban planning think tank in the Bay Area, it showed that over the last 20 years, we're short nearly 700,000 homes. That's a huge deficit without even accounting for new demand as population grows. And when it comes to affordable housing, which is the housing that's been most impacted by the pandemic, and the people who live in affordable housing who've been the most impacted, we need the most of those types of homes. We need affordable housing. The same report looked at nearly 500,000 homes that were short, even without accounting for the new housing we have to build to keep up with demand. And when you think about why we haven't built that housing, it's really complicated. Housing is an emotional issue, and it's the jumping off point for so many things in our lives. We talked about this over and over again in the podcast, but it's your access to good jobs, to good schools, to clean air, parks, bike lanes, grocery stores, determines how likely you're going to end up in jail, or, what kind of job you get, or whether you go to college. And typically it's the single largest investment that any family makes. So, I understand that because you have such an investment in it, it makes it so emotional. It makes change really difficult. But we also have to acknowledge that, a lot of people's perceptions about what kind of housing they'll allow in their neighborhoods is deeply rooted in racism. And that's influenced our policies, our housing policies, for the last 2 centuries, for actually since the beginning of this country. And, we've benefited white families. Those housing policies have benefited white families at the expense of people of color and everyone other than white families. And so, homeowners have a disproportionate say in housing policy. Local politicians listen to homeowners. They're typically strong voters, and they've been really resistant to multifamily housing, and particularly low-income housing. And in fact, just today, we got a scathing report from the California auditor finding that many cities routinely put up barriers to new housing against state law, and particularly multifamily housing that makes housing more expensive to build.
Erin, thank you so much. And I actually want to bring in the rest of our panel tonight to join us to talk. And so we have a panel of experts, of people who are really involved in housing. We have Jennifer Loving, the CEO of Destination Home. We have Pastor Paul Bains, who's the founder, president, and CEO of WeHOPE. Rebecca Prozan, who is the head of Google Government Affairs and Public Policy for the West Coast. Julie Mahowald, interim CFO and CEO of Housing Trust Silicon Valley, and Khanh Russo, the senior director of the Partnership for the Bay's Future and Great Communities Collaborative. Thank you all so much for being with us tonight. And Jennifer, I want to start with you. We have a pretty stark income gap here in the Bay Area. Can you explain to us a little bit more about that, and how has the success of the tech industry contributed to that, particularly as it relates to the housing crisis?
first, thanks for having me, and it's really nice to be here. And a lot of what Erin said was really sort of foundationally a lot of the problems that we have. We have the highest rates of income inequality in the nation here. Over the last 5 years, the wealthiest people made more money, and the poorest people made less. And so the divide keeps growing, right? Our taxes aren't what they should be. There are some sectors, private sector has made a lot of money. And then the question is, well, what does that mean for the community, and how do we invest that money in communities where these companies are doing business? And what does it mean to be a good neighbor? And so we have this confluence of some of the deepest suffering, which is, again, disproportionately families of color, BIPOC households that are making the least, and we're watching homelessness grow. And then we have a set of circumstances where at the end of the day, we can talk about building or codes or money or whatever, but we solve problems that we want to solve all the time. This is a problem that we have not truly wanted to solve. And we see that in the votes at cities. We see that with the resources that are allocated, whether it's federal or state or locally, land use policies, and so all of those things together contribute to really now what is a catastrophic humanitarian crisis.
And now thanks, Jennifer. And now I want to bring in Pastor Paul Bains from WeHOPE. Pastor Bains, can you tell me the impact of the tech boom on the community that you work with in East Palo Alto? And how has it affected people's ability to afford to live here in the communities that they've been in for a long time?
Well, I would say, I always describe East Palo Alto as having Google on one side, Facebook on another, and Stanford on the third, and then we have the ocean on the fourth. And so we are kind of compressed because of these are great companies you want to work for and a great school you want to work for. And so it has really caused the community to be oversaturated with high cost of living because the proximity of which city of East Palo Alto is to these tech companies and to Stanford. So where before homes were going for, a couple $100,000, now they're going for 1.5 million and 2 million in East Palo Alto, which was unheard of, 10 years ago. And so it has broke up the fabric of the community, where this community was once known as, in the 90s, obviously the murder capital of the country per capita, but we've changed and we've grown. And then now it's not the murders that have plagued our city, but the high cost to live here. And so we have families that now have to move out to Tracy or have to move out to Madero and then commute in if they want to see their relatives or for the jobs because they can't afford to live in the city that they grew up in anymore.
And I want to ask you also about the inequities in housing, the historic inequities in housing, in particular for the Bay Area's Black communities, and how you have seen those exacerbated or play out in recent years.
Well, I mean, let's face it, let's be candid here. 73% of white Americans basically have home ownership compared to Black Americans is around 44%, somewhere in that category. And, because of redlining, it has disproportionately affected Blacks to the point where we were kept from wealth generation, from home ownership. If you're going to disrupt generational poverty, you do that through education and you do that through home ownership. And because of the redlining policies that were backed by the government and by big banks that prevented Blacks from buying homes in more, educational appropriate areas like Palo Alto, we were forced to be in East Palo Alto. That's only because the city of the bankers would only give us loans in those particular communities. And so therefore we've kept out of creating that generational wealth for other families beyond just our own. And it's been horrible because once you're behind, it's very hard to catch up if you can even catch up.
Mm-hmm. Now, I want to thank you, Pastor Bains. Now, Rebecca, I want to go to you and talk about, I think it's fair to say for quite a few years, people were calling on tech companies to get more involved locally to work on these issues. So why was 2018, 2019, why were those the years when we started to really see Google and others get involved and start to really pledge to get involved?
Thank you, Erika, for hosting this event, and I'm honored to be on this panel with everyone. I can't speak for the other companies. I can only say that we have been involved in the housing conversation actually dating back to 2012. We did an op-ed in the Mountain View Voice asking Mountain View to increase the zoning for homes in North Bayshore. So this has been marinating for a long time. I don't know if there was one specific event or thing that happened in 2018 or 2019. All I can say is it's a lot of conversations. We took a lot of thought to really put together how we could make it unique and not just an affordable housing fund. And we were honored to make that commitment at that time.
And tell me, so when we hear $1 billion, it might sound like, Google is giving away $1 billion, but that's not how it works. Tell us sort of where's that money going and what does that signify?
Yep, thanks. Thank you again. So again, what makes it unique is it's not just an affordable housing fund. We definitely wanted to bring in land as an asset because land use is such an important asset when you're trying to solve something that is, as you said, as thorny as housing is. And also Google.org is a part of it too. So I like to call it 1 billion plus. So the 250 million of the 1 billion is an affordable housing fund. Anyone can apply for it. We had originally pledged to 5,000 homes that we would fund with that 250 million. It's not a $1 to one home, excuse me, effort. We ended up supporting Factory OS, which is a modular housing investment. And so that 5,000 that we originally committed to is now 24,000. And I know these are a lot of numbers and I apologize, and hopefully people will be able to rewind and listen to it again. In terms of the land, that is a $750 million commitment to repurpose that land to include residential as well as commercial. So that is the land that we own in Mountain View, Sunnyvale, and San Jose. We are hopeful that we will be able to build 15,000 units on those properties. Obviously, we won't be able to get shovels in the ground and finish that within the next 10 years, but we definitely wanted to show commitment and impact in what we were doing. And then finally, Google.org has committed $50 million to the issue of homelessness, helping with the direct services. And so that's also part of the commitment, and that makes it the 1 billion plus. So 250 million in affordable housing fund, $750 million in land that we're repurposing, and then $50 million from Google.org.
And tell me why is housing important to Google in the Bay Area here?
Well, I mean, you set it up perfectly for us. We believe too that supply has been that there just has not been enough supply, period, across the board, from extremely affordable, ELI is the term, all the way up to market rate. And so we believe that the use of land and creating those units will help alleviate that crisis. We wanted to be part of the solution, and that was our commitment to that end.
And I want to, so what sort of progress would you say has been made so far? I know you said we're not going to build 15,000 units in 10 years, but where, and it's just a couple of years out from this pledge, but where have we seen progress so far?
So we've put out 115 million of the 250 million. So the numbers are, again, it's not going to be an A plus B equals C. But we have funded around 1,200 units with that 115. Not all of that is actually out. I'm sure Julie will talk about this in her portion, because 100 of that million is with the Housing Trust of Silicon Valley, because they're such a proven track leader in developing housing in the region. And so that's that portion. In terms of the land, we are in constant conversation with the city of Mountain View. We have put forward around 7,000 units, both in North Bayshore and in the East Wisman neighborhoods. And then obviously we just had the city of San Jose just had a study session on our San Jose project, and we think there'll be 4,000 units coming from that as well. So on the land portion, things are in development, conversations are happening. We hope that we will be successful in city votes soon. On the affordable portion, it's around 1,200 units with 115 million out, not necessarily dispersed, with more to come. But I'm pleased to report that we're more than 10% towards our goal over the 10 years.
Great. Now I do want to, you mentioned Julie Mahowald, Silicon Valley, Housing Trust Silicon Valley, and I wanted to bring you in because a lot of this, not just from Google, but from Apple and Facebook and others, it is investment in affordable housing, and that's where you come in. And so I know affordable housing investment is an incredibly complex subject, but if you could explain to us a little bit about how these funds work and what they make, what this money makes possible.
Sure. Thanks, Erika. It's really great to be here with this esteemed group. And it is super complex. I will try to keep it simple, and I'll just really distill what the tech investments have been to date with Housing Trust and a few other organizations. Housing Trust, just as a background, is a nonprofit bank. So we're also called a community development finance institution. So we can receive very limited government money, and we act as an intermediary, bringing financing into, in particular for our organization, affordable housing in the Bay Area. So as an intermediary, we can source funds and then leverage them with government or grant funding, and then quickly deploy them to developers to help them compete in this competitive market. So when a developer needs to acquire land for affordable housing, they're competing against the market rate developer, and they're often a nonprofit. And with other capital, and I'll talk about the different types, we can also help them bridge the gaps in the very complex long-term financing that they have to put together to make a project successful. And so we play that part in getting these homes to construction and get residents in their homes sooner. And that's what this capital is doing for us. We're also known as patient capital. So as a nonprofit, if a project experiences delays, we're more patient than a typical bank or investor. We're looking for that social good of a home and the benefits that brings to our Bay Area residents. And that's what these tech companies and philanthropy have joined us in doing so. So there are a couple different ways it's been happening, really super innovative of late. Companies have lent us money at below market rates. Companies like Cisco, LinkedIn, NetApp, and Google, part of that big announcement, Pure Storage, and some mission investing philanthropy like Packard, Grove, and Sbrato. They lent us 5- and 10-year money with few strings attached, and we can revolve that multiple times, making low interest loans to these developers. So again, they can acquire the home, acquire the land to get the pre-development work going so they can get into construction. And to date, we've raised $117 million through that effort, and over 3 years, and we've started up and preserved 3,400 Bay Area homes with that, what we call the tech fund. And again, 50 million of that has come from what Rebecca was talking about. We've had a few apartments open in those investments, but it does take a long time to get them through the whole process to construction. But I think starting in 2021, we're going to start to see a lot more grand openings of these homes and see people getting into their homes. The second way was the second part of Google's investment, which we're calling the Launch Initiative. And there, Google's investing side by side with Housing Trust. They're using their own balance sheet capital, not lending to us. And we're their advisor and fund manager, and we're really partnering to make these low-cost loans, both in the acquisition that I talked about earlier, but also right now we're starting to co-create some different ways of investing in some different types of affordable housing. So it's really been a synergy to work with them. And it's also created an ability for our nonprofit to do more work more quickly because we don't have to raise as much debt because we're using the Google fund. And so as Rebecca mentioned, this specific fund where we're investing side by side, we've deployed in only 9 months, over half of it, 26 million, and starting up 640 homes just on that part of the fund. The full fund is spoken for at this time. There's just a lot of demand, and we're really working well together to get that to happen. And then the last way that it can happen, or one of the many ways, but the last one to talk about today, is through grant capital. And that an example of that is the Apple Affordable Housing Fund, where Apple has granted Housing Trust over 10 years, 150 million. At the same time, they granted to Jen's organization, Destination Home, 50 million over 5 years. And with grant funding, there's no cost and we're not required to repay it. So we can lend at even lower cost to developers. And then we're also able to be a little more creative with the funds in that we can go longer term and fill in gaps for long terms. It happens often that an affordable housing project, because of the complex financing, could get stuck and find itself ready to start construction, have all of its pre-development done, but not quite have pulled all the financing together. And so to get grant funding like this, we can actually provide our developers that gap financing and get those shovels in the ground quicker, maybe a year or two faster. And so initially with Apple, we've made 4 loans to unstick projects like that. And then Facebook had a small fund that we participated in that was similar. There was some grant capital from Facebook. I know that Khan's organization is working with Facebook funds and Destination Home to do some other work too. And also Cisco, I believe, made a big grant to Destination Home, and they've been able to deploy that in a lot of different ways.
Is it possible to put, I know, like with Rebecca was saying, there's a lot of numbers, and is it possible to put a number on how many people, how many units are in these projects that have gotten started, how, what kind of dent we might be making? I know the mountain is a big one, but in the projects that you referenced, how many units are we talking overall?
Well, so in the tech fund alone, it's 3,400 homes that have started up in the past 3 years. Adding to that, this launch initiative, another at least 600 that we've just approved in 8 months. The Facebook fund, I don't have a number for, and I'm sure Jen could comment on Destination Home. Often we see them lending in other projects that we're in as well. So it's a dent. I mean, especially given the quick time frame, I think. And if we do have 10 years to deploy these funds, we're going to be able to make up some of that gap.
Thank you, Julie. And I want to bring in Khanh Russo from the Partnership for the Bay's Future and Great Communities Collaborative. Khanh, thank you for being with us. And I know you work in partnerships, and I know we are highlighting tonight tech, certainly, but there's a lot of other businesses, big businesses here in the Bay Area. And so I'm curious to know from you how you see the role of not just tech, but business in general in sort of in addressing this crisis that we all face, that we all live with. What is the role? Khanh, you're muted for some reason. It doesn't say you are, but I can't hear you.
Sorry about that. Erika, thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. And again, I'm so humbled to be on a panel with folks whom I would describe as, social justice warriors, right? People who've been in this fight for a very long time. I think, one of the opportunities in terms of working with businesses in general is that it's a symbiotic relationship, and it's about being in community. When we talk in community, it's about all aspects of the community. And I think in particular, the Partnership for the Bay's Future, which is a San Francisco Foundation initiative, it really helps, our goal is to really help make affordable across the Bay Area with a unique dual approach. And one, in collaboration with partners, we work to really advance policy changes that protect residents and improve affordability. And then we invest in building new and rehabilitating existing affordable homes, always through this lens of racial equity and economic inclusion. And I think one of the exciting things about being in partnership with businesses is that we get to bring that lens of racial equity and economic inclusion to the work, to the policy advocacy. one of the biggest things that sets the partnership apart from other housing efforts is that we have a fundamental focus on collaboration between the philanthropic, private, and the public sector. And our cross-sector approach really involving engaging our state and local leaders, our faith and community leaders, making sure that housing developers, businesses, and service organizations are at the table. So we are able to bring together the really varied resources and expertise to find the best solution to ensure that people of different races and from different places can call the Bay Area home. So we're proud to have folks like CZI and Genentech and Morgan Stanley and Facebook and Silicon Valley Community Foundation a part of our partnership.
Well, and I want to ask you, you mentioned policy changes, and we've been talking a lot about money, but everybody I've talked to, and everyone here will say $5 billion sounds like a lot of money, but when you talk about $500,000 maybe to build one home, one apartment in the Bay Area, which is a very common number, it's not enough. And so what are the policy changes that you see important for you and this group to push forward in order to make that money go farther, make sure that we're building the housing that we need to be building?
Yeah, it's really about removing these barriers, right, that make it so difficult to build. I think one of the great things that happened of recent past is the CASA Compact, which is a clear strategy for what types of policies we need to approve. And there's been really great progress on the protection and preservation types of policies. On the production policies, we've been able to remove barriers to building accessory dwelling units. We've been able to improve access to surplus land for affordable housing, right? These are the things that allows us to be creative and innovative and be able to increase and accelerate the production of housing. Rebecca mentioned a little bit earlier, there are investments in different types of building styles and modular construction. So we need to make it easier to be able to use and build those types of homes to meet the need.
Now, you also mentioned, being in partnership with philanthropy and business and government. I think nobody here would say, Google, everybody take your money and go home. But there's also, some critique and question of, should we really be relying on our corporations for donations, for philanthropy, for investments? And shouldn't we be, looking to taxations? And again, not just to tech, but to business in general to make sure that we are building the housing that we need.
I think, Erika, that's really the point, right? Like, it's not about tech or business, it's about community, and everybody is a part of that. And we need to really be able to come together to really identify what our priorities are and really act in crisis, as Jennifer talked about, right? I think that one of the realities for us is one of the biggest need is the extremely low income housing that Pastor Bains talked about. And Jennifer, maybe you can talk a little bit more about the specific extremely low income policies that we're advocating for and is directly connected to the racial inequities in our community.
Sure, Erika, if that's okay.
Yeah, please. I was just going to ask you the same question, so go for it. Thanks.
So extremely low income is a term that puts basically the lowest level of income. If you're talking about area median income is around, I don't know, like $94,000 a year. And then as you move down the affordability spectrum in the Bay, you might make 80% of area median or 60% or 50. But we're talking, when we say extremely low income, we're talking about people that make 0 to 30% of area median income. For a one person, that's under $30,000 a year. For a family of 4, that's about $43,000 a year or less. And so you can imagine that people are living in horrifically sort of precarious situations. That this income category is disproportionately families of color. I think it's like maybe 20% of Black households are in this income category. About half of this income category would have a disabled member in their household. We're talking about historically oppressed, discriminated, and marginalized folks that are now then competing for homes that the market will never build extremely low income affordability. When we talk about building all types of housing, or we talk about, people think that if you build more expensive housing, then there's, more housing that gets freed up. When it comes to this level of affordability, it never will happen on accident. And so I think Khanh is talking about the policies that need to happen in order to really have a commitment to this level of affordability. And this is something that that jurisdictions need to commit to, and then compel private sector, philanthropy, tech, whatever, the additional resources to meet those goals. And Santa Clara County did that in 2016 with the passage of Measure A. Measure A was a $950 million housing bond, with the lion's share of that money going towards extremely low income housing. The city of San Jose subsequently set a policy that 45% of their housing dollars would go towards extremely low income housing. And then the Santa Clara County Housing Authority set a similar priority. So now you have all of these jurisdictions saying two things. One, building housing for the poorest, most vulnerable people is a priority. And two, we're going to put some money into this. Since 2016, there have been 30 Measure A projects in Santa Clara County for extremely low income people and for homeless people, 30. And that is because of the will of the elected officials, the will of the public sector, and the policies that they were able to enact. And then Julie mentioned money like Apple and Cisco both making philanthropic commitments. The most flexible money, the most useful money is money that is philanthropic, gap filling, risky money that we can use basically to get these projects going. That money combined with these public measures have meant 30 more projects.
And I mean, it sounds like there's been a lot of progress there in Santa Clara County, but the fact is there is so much resistance still when low-income housing, multifamily housing comes up in so many places. And so how do we get that to change or get past some of that resistance?
I mean, think about how absurd it is. Let's say that we weren't talking about housing. Let's say we were talking about treatment for cancer. And there was a whole lot of people. There were 10,000 people in Santa Clara County that needed this medicine. And elected officials in cities were able to provide it, right? And all these other people who don't need the medicine or aren't sick or are all coming and saying, how dare you do this? This is terrible. Don't help those people. I mean, this is what like housing policy has turned into, this crazy sort of a thing where people are thinking that somehow that if we provide more housing for people, that somehow there's something bad is happening to them. It's rooted in racism. It's rooted in historical policies around redlining and segregation. The Color of Law is a great book that talks about the historical policies and practices that this Bay Area has done has contributed to this, and that people still somehow subscribe to today. We went through a very public issue in the last month. The Silicon Valley Chamber, the SVO organization, their PAC put out a mailer that was sort of making it look like opportunity housing, which is the gentlest density that you could imagine, like putting a duplex or a triplex in single family zoned neighborhoods was like the equivalent of like bringing like riots to your neighborhood. These tactics are still being used today and people are falling for it.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know there's interest in trying to change zoning and allow single family zoning. Do you think that is something that could be helpful to allow for more, because there are so many places here in the Bay Area in California where you can only build single family homes. Is that something that you think needs to change?
Yes. San Jose is zone 94% single family. Why is that? Who is that serving?
And I wanted to, and so I mean, I know that came up in the legislature, and I've heard it could come up again in the next legislature as well. Now, going to the extremely low income housing, Julie, in the funding that we're talking about, Is there quite a lot of that in this funding? Like who's getting housed and through these projects, and how is that determined?
What's really interesting is what Jen was saying. The Measure A in Santa Clara County has made 950 million available, or about 750 million, I think, specifically for building permanent supportive housing for extremely low income, made it available. So developers see that capability. This is what I can build, and it has driven them there. And most of our funds are agnostic. We would like to build extremely low income housing, but it's not restricted. Some of our funders have, though, been expressing an interest. Some of these tech companies have said, this is where we want to go. We see this as a need. We see everything we said today about its basis in structural racism, and we'd like to build extremely low income housing. So a large portion of it has, because of all these different factors, actually been going to some of the, a big chunk of the 34 projects that, or 30 projects that Jen mentioned.
Mm-hmm. And Pastor Bains, what kind of housing, what kind of projects do you see as most important to come out of all these partnerships and all these efforts?
Well, I think there's a few things. I think that when people, first of all, they need to realize that it's not just the tech companies that has been a part of the problem of creating the problem. But you also have biotech, you have Genentech, you have Gilead. They also need to lean in on these issues and pony up. So let's not just lay it all on the tech companies. But in regards to the crisis, I've been working in the field of homelessness for 20 plus years. And we have jobs programs, we have food programs, we have shelters throughout the Bay Area. But what we're missing is, what we were discussing is that Eli housing, that extremely low income housing. I see what some nonprofit developers are doing, and they're doing some great work, but they're not really hitting that particular target market. That is missing. And so I'm going to be candid. I'm highly disappointed that we have the usual suspects, the normal players getting the lion's share of the resources, not doing what they could do. Because I'm sitting here listening to these conversations year after year and seeing how people of color, particularly Black people, have been disproportionately affected by the redlining. And Richard Rothenstein's book is a great book, The Color of Law. And I see little effect that's happening specifically on Black and Brown Americans. They talk about affordable housing, but where's the rubber hitting the road when you see who's getting housed? It's not there. And I'm living this. So, I have to push back on some of what people are saying, that, Google and Apple is the savior. They're incrementally putting in a certain amount of money, but they're not the only ones. If we don't change the policies, all of this is going to be for naught. It's the policies is where the power is, and then where there's a will, there will be a way. That's why we're creating a factory. I've been in the housing business. We're creating a factory. It's called Indy Dwell, California, and it's specifically targeting 30% AMI folks. And a 2-bedroom house is going to be $85,000. We know that steel modular is the fastest way to get someone housed. It's 40% faster and 30 to 50% cheaper, depending on what the market is. So creating a factory right here in East Palo Alto, we're creating jobs. These are things that we know are going to work because we've been working with the homeless and the marginalized for 20 plus years. Everybody can do all these other pie in the sky things and what have you, which I think it will be forward moving, but where the rubber hits the road is, how is it impacting the Black and Brown people? I don't see it. I'm not seeing it. And I'm just being candid about it.
And I want to ask you, Rebecca, I know Google has talked not specifically to housing that I've heard about pledges towards racial equity this year, but I'm curious to know, to Pastor Bains' point, what in your pledges and in your projects is being done to ensure equity and to improve, housing disparities?
The pastor brings up a great point, and I think the issue is that housing takes a long time to build. So while we funded those 1,200 units, those doors aren't going to be open next month. It's going to take years. It took us years to get us into this, and it's going to take us years to get out. I think for Google, the issue for us is making sure that we're providing access to opportunity from the housing portion, and we just announced 500 units on Monday with 2 projects in San Jose and Sunnyvale, a portion of which do address 30% ELI and lower. Secondarily, but it's also not just housing. We have invested $10 million in an AP STEM effort to try to get 3,000 students of color around the Bay Area into those programs. And the other thing I wanted to discuss in terms of access to opportunity on housing is Google loaned employees to the city of San Francisco in 2015 to create the first of its kind affordable housing portal. It used to be, and I'm sure the pastor knows this more than anyone else on this podcast, that you would have to go to 10 different housing units, file 10 different paper applications, and then pray one would come through. What the Google employees did at that time was they did what tech calls the user interface, user experience, research to talk to the nonprofits, talk to participants, talk to government agencies, and figure out how we can make this affordable housing portal work. That was the basis for what is now called Dahlia. Within its first 2 years, 200,000 applications were created online for affordable housing opportunities. And so again, in terms of racial justice, it's the access to opportunity that's so critical. And so I think those things, again, across the board, education, housing, and Black plus small business. Google invested in Main Street Launch this year to help businesses in Mountain View and San Francisco, Black businesses in Mountain View and San Francisco succeed.
And I just want to say one thing. I want to give you an example of where there's a will, there can be a way. You take San Jose, Sam McCardle has a project, it's called Evans Lane. He put it out to bid in July. Habitat for Humanity, Indy Dwell, California, and Sand Hill Foundation won the bid. It's 36 modules to house 120 people, most of them homeless families. It will be completed by December. That's 4 months. So that's a real live example of what can be done when we come together with private-public partnerships. So it can be done quicker, even though in general, yes, it's going to take a long because of the policies that are currently in the zoning that's currently in place. Everything has to be lined up for that type of project to be executed in that time frame.
And again, just wanted to add that that's also one of the reasons why we invested in Factory OS. We're creating a second factory for them to be able to accelerate that production. And I look forward to working with you on making sure that we are practicing what we preach.
Yeah, this is Khanh with the Partnership for the Bay's Future. Pastor Bains, I love what you the examples you just gave, because I think it finally demonstrates us acting in crisis, right? I think we've been talking about us being in a housing crisis for so long that it doesn't mean anything anymore. And the example that you provided is an example of how you should be acting, what needs to be done when you actually recognize that you are in crisis. I think the reality is because so many of our systems have not been designed with an equity lens, too many of us are left merely surviving, right, in unhealthy environments under the threat that one unforeseen problem will have us out on the streets. And the consequences of this is that it's driving up costs for everybody. Like the NIMBYs out there, those who are opposed to affordable housing, are really fighting against their own self-interest, because the reality is that we simply cannot afford to ignore this issue anymore. It will cost all of us too much to ignore the housing crisis, right? Every day that we don't all lean forward to kind of solve this makes the situation really even worse. And what's really sad, especially from a racial equity perspective, is that for too many of our neighborhoods, they really lack the pathway to opportunity. The redlining has prevented and has stunted their opportunity, and they don't they can't get the critical resources that would allow them to build wealth and connect to resources for wellness and pursue their aspirations. Like, I think for us to be safe and stay well, both physically and mentally, and this is demonstrated over and over with the pandemic, right? For our children to grow and elders to flourish, we really need to ensure that all of us have housing that we can count on, and our region will prosper most when we all prosper. So I think it's really helping to shift that narrative and helping people understand that voting against housing at all is voting against their own self-interest and voting against their ability to stay in community and their children to stay in this community.
But I think that voting against housing happens so often. You see it at local, local city councils, local supervisors, local, and at the state level. I mean, there's certainly a movement to counteract that. We have VMBs who, yes, in my backyard want to build as much as possible everywhere. So do you think, or how do we get past that resistance, like at the local city council level, and the planning commission level?
We have to keep passing streamlining legislation. we need to stop asking for permission, to say that we have to make excuses about why someone who's poorer than someone else has the right to live at a place this is not the right way to solve problems. We should be deciding the amount of housing that we need, all available places that it can go, and we should all be making sure that housing happens. And streamlining, like we've been, AB 2162, which is supportive housing streamlining. Other legislation is part of what we need from the policy perspective so that we can move things along quicker.
And have you've seen a lot of resistance when you've tried to advocate for housing and for?
There was a project, Home Key is the governor's initiative where money was made available to purchase hotels or motels and convert them into housing for homeless folks. And so there's a project in Milpitas. And so the Home Key money included this streamlining, legislation. Some barriers were removed, and cities have freaked out. The city of Milpitas, the mayor wanted to sue the state of California over turning an old motel into housing that could be really turned very quickly into housing to support the most vulnerable people that live in that community. And of course, there's no lawsuit now, and it was dropped. But like, this is what happens, and there becomes this energy of like having to fight back. That for some reason that I own a piece of this community that someone else does not. We have to stop having this up for debate.
And when you say streamlining, just remind us what that means. It's streamlining of permitting processes.
The process, right? So like streamlining so that the process doesn't have to go through all of like the hurdles of where things can get stuck, right? It's moving the process, moving the proposal or the project along more quickly.
Because that really, that adds to time. Sorry, go ahead, Pastor Bains.
I'm saying it's cutting out a lot of the bureaucracy. And if I look at the city of East Palo Alto, we're 2.5 square miles. Okay, we passed yes on HH, which was, affordable housing and good jobs tax on big businesses that were coming in there. So it was an additional tax, a partial tax on the rooms that were going to be developed. There's all kind of ways and strategies that can be implemented in any community. It's just if the people will come together, as Khanh was saying earlier, I'm a firm believer that none of us, big tech, school, faith-based community, nonprofits, is as strong as all of us. It's just, can we just check our egos at the door and let's just come together and work on a systemic structural problem that can really uplift and help people kind. So if we can do it in East Palo Alto, which I think has the most aggressive, affordable housing policies and projects in the whole Bay Area, we're looking at trying to build 500 new units in this very small community within the next 6 years. That's extremely aggressive, but there is a will. And where there's a will, there can be a way. I'm finished preaching.
If I can just also, say that, the barriers that both Pastor Bains and Jennifer are talking about were intentionally put in to prevent the progress of housing, right? Like they themselves are example of the racist policies. And that's why we need to really think about changing this at the state policy level and really push for policy change to then streamline. Like we need to be able to, it's gonna be too hard to change those policies from that city to city, right? Like there's a recognition that there's a moral imperative right now about the racial equity that needs to happen in the housing industry and the housing sector. And policy is really going to be, it's necessary to really correct those and dismantle those unjust systems that are keeping people in this perpetual cycle of hardship.
Mm-hmm. I think there's so much more to say, but I also want to bring in some of the questions from our audience. And this might be good for you, Pastor Bains, there in East Palo Alto. The first question I have is, many of the most vulnerable populations in our regions live along the shoreline in communities that were once redlined and could soon flood. How do we build more affordable housing while still protecting existing and future residents from climate impacts like fire and flooding? Is that built into what you're thinking of, Pastor Bains?
Well, it has to be. I mean, we are shoring up our borders here in East Palo Alto. They've done all type of environmental studies and things of that nature. And you have these major development companies that are trying to come in here, but they cannot come in here without the voice of the people. And so that's why they're having these meetings with the community leaders, those and just your average person in East Palo Alto. And we're navigating the process together. And we're looking at, okay, you want to do Class A building here in East Palo Alto, you want to build some high-tech buildings in here. What are you going to do to help address the affordable housing issue? And again, affordable housing is relative to who can afford it. We're talking about true, extremely low-income housing in East Palo Alto. That's what we're working on, 30% and 50% AMI. That's what the majority of the housing is going to be built on. In regards to, I think you said something about the border, was it?
Right, I think.
Yeah, I mean, like I said earlier, we only have 4 entry points into our city. And, you know, the state will have to help us with any type of environmental flooding. We are in a flood zone. We know that. And I know that I don't know if it's the Metropolitan Committee that's working on this process, but I do know that developers are part of the process of solving it. We have where people came and dumped toxic waste in our city, and all of that's been being cleaned up or have been cleaned up in most cases. So we do have communications happening right now with the developers and with the state, or excuse me, the federal government in regards to how do we protect our community.
And again, we're getting a question about evictions. Now we've been talking a lot about, you know, building and increasing supply, but there's also, you know, especially with the pandemic, there is a true concern that a lot of people will be evicted, and so we will end up with more people homeless in the coming months and years. And I'm curious, you know, what is, I mean, maybe Jennifer, this is a question for you. What focus does there need to be on keeping people housed to begin with? And where is that focus?
So I'm so glad. That's such a great question. This is literally the most urgent thing that we can be doing right now. When COVID hit, right, and we went to shelter in place early, we knew that disproportionately extremely low income households, disproportionately families of color were going to be hit the hardest. And we knew that because we already do homelessness prevention work year round. And we know from the data, like who is falling into homelessness. So we've coordinated this countywide effort to try to help as many families as we can. First, it was just financial assistance. There was a whole lot of people that were left out of the federal stimulus again. Families of color, folks that undocumented, people that were not entitled to either stimulus or unemployment. So needed financial assistance. We received like 32,000 requests for help in like a very short amount of time. since the eviction moratorium with the state of California, since that legislation, AB 3088, has passed, what that says is by January 31st, 2021, families have to pay 25% of what they owe during COVID. So from March to current, they have to pay 25% of that back rent, and then they cannot be evicted. And the rest of that money doesn't disappear. It can convert to civil debt. So it's still not great for families, but they have to pay 25% to not lose their homes. That was not accompanied with a financial package. And so jurisdictions are using federal CARES money, they're using private money, they're using any money that we can get our hands on to pay as much of that 25% for us. We're doing this for extremely low income households as possible. We have nowhere near the money that is necessary to take care of the need. That's true for San Francisco, Alameda, every county in the Bay. And so we're literally watching the slowest moving train crash in history that has been coming for us since March, that is still coming for us. And we have a couple more months to do everything that we can to keep families from losing their homes. And I am telling you, it is not that much money per household. You know, families are already renting places that are not necessarily great. And so their rents might be lower. They might be renting garages. They might be doubled or tripled or quadrupled up. All of these things are happening. Families have done things that are heartbreaking, like payday lending, predatory loans. Things are ready to try to pay their landlords. We have this opportunity right now that we should all be doing. Every city, every county, every philanthropist, every tech company should be funding rent relief to keep families from losing their homes. It will be this humanitarian crisis that we already have will be like a tsunami, and it is completely preventable. And not having federal stimulus, not having rent relief, these unconscionable decisions that the federal government has made is disproportionately hurting families of color, poorest families. I mean, I'm sorry, I could tell you stories about this for hours, about how horrible what's happening right now is for people. And we could stop it.
And do you, Rebecca, I don't know if rent assistance or anything like that, is that part of what Google has proposed doing or is doing? I'm sorry, I don't know.
I forgot to double check that. I want to make sure I'm giving you accurate facts. So let me go back, and that would be on the foundation side. So let me go back and check, and I will get back to you.
Great, thank you. Now I have a question here about Prop 13 and its impact on our housing prices, and is any, oh, maybe I have a different question. Is any of the money being invested in changing the existing policies that contributed to the shortfall? We were talking about policies. Is any of the money or any of the efforts that you're talking about really going towards changing those policies? Maybe that's a question for you, Khanh.
Yeah, you know, there was a unique opportunity during this last election. It was called the Schools and Community First proposition, and it was the first opportunity we had for some reform of Proposition 13, and it narrowly lost. You know, and Prop 15 was a real opportunity just to really fix those inequities, but it kind of speaks to, and it did not pass, and it really then speaks to the work that we have to do still. You know, I think that Prop 13 was considered, you know, untouchable, right? And it took us 10 years just to get to a point where we could really reform a very small part of Prop 13, and it still did not pass. So the short answer is, you know, it's really about what we talked about before, really the narrative shift and changing the hearts and minds, and really helping communities understand that, you know, we have to refuse to not leave anybody behind, not leave communities behind, and we're not there yet. So I think that, you know, something that we'll continue to work on. I think we've made a lot of great progress and movement with the Schools and Community First Proposition 15, but we still have a long ways to go.
Now, I think we've been talking a lot about, you know, what can companies do? What can governments do? But we've had a couple questions come in from people, you know, what can individuals do? to move the needle on housing? How do people get involved?
I mean, a free way is to tell your elected official that you support the affordable housing project in your neighborhood. We have something called Housing Ready Communities in Santa Clara County that is really trying to have neighbors, faith communities, any one of us, when a project comes up in our neighborhood, and usually there's this outcry against it, we need people who are willing to tell their mayor or their elected official that this is fine by me. I would love for there to be more housing where I live. I mean, that's easy and free. And when it comes to supporting families that are in trouble right now, there's some sort of rental assistance effort that is happening in every jurisdiction in the Bay. And so I can share that information, but there are places if you wanted to make a donation for groups that are literally just doing everything they can right now to make sure that families don't lose their homes come January 31st.
Does anyone else want to chime in there?
I mean, it's, again, I mean, I use the example of UCA. It's Youth United for Community Action. They're a small group of people, small, young adults, mostly teenagers. They were able to get Romic Chemical out of East Palo Alto. Okay. And so always, I think the power is in the people. Do the people have the willingness to want to come together? That to me is where the rubber hits the road. You have the faith community, you have the nonprofit community. We've been able to move mountains here in East Palo Alto. And I think that same process can be utilized maybe in smaller geographical chunks in the larger cities, but it can, with that district manager or that district supervisor or that county supervisor, it can happen. So when we can come together, again, I think that's where the power is.
And just to add to what Jen and Pastor said, just bringing the community together, talk to your friends, educate your friends, read The Color of Law. And now when you can go to a city council meeting on Zoom, it's not only free, it's easy. You can be in your pajamas and you can advocate for affordable housing. So just be a part of it.
Another thing I'd add is support elected officials who support housing. Like make sure because what happens is in Brisbane and San Bruno, I don't know what's going to happen in Milpitas, but there's a lot of elected officials that fear passing housing projects because they think they won't get reelected. And we need to send a message that if they do, they will.
And I think I have one more question about working together for Rebecca and maybe for you, Khanh, as well. About we have so many groups involved, so many passionate groups involved, and making commitments. How do you work together to make sure that this stuff gets done in the most effective way and the people who need it get it?
I mean, I have to say, I've always been. I came from Cisco and was always been committed to housing. And so I understand the tech sector to some extent. And I've been really proud of how the tech sector, the business community has come together around this, right? The project that Pastor Bains talked about in San Jose, where they were able to build 300 units in 5 months is unheard of. And that's because volunteers came out to build the homes and investors came in early, and we had folks like Google investing in different manufacturing capabilities to accelerate it. And I think that that's the kind of spirit we need to continue bringing and coming together with. I think I would love it if we continue to leverage all of our expertise in a way that advances these policies, right? Like all of our corporations have influence at the state and federal level that we don't have, and we would love to be able to join them in pushing for these policies. The technology companies have actual technology and tools that they can develop to kind of better educate and inform the public, right? And help change the narrative. They have incredible tools around analytics and predictive analytics that can help us kind of be proactive at identifying folks who are most at risk. So what I would say is continue to do more of what we're already doing, right? And coming together and continue to talk to each other and then align and coordinate all of our power.
It's not helpful when one entity does a random fund or big thing out of coordination with the local jurisdictions. It's just not helpful. What's helpful is when the companies that are doing business figure out what the problems are that need to be solved and get in there and try to work together towards solving those problems, right? Because the biggest funder is always going to be the county safety net. The biggest decision maker is always going to be the jurisdiction that has land use determination. And so what we should really be doing is saying, how do we further these goals? What are your goals? How many units of extremely low income, affordable, what are you trying to do? How can our money be best served? Which is not always how it happens. And I think if jurisdictions were to take more policy positions like Santa Clara County did with Measure A, they created a funding mechanism, and then they were able to have other groups come around and support the execution of that funding mechanism, which is how you start to see progress.
And I would just add that we're having these conversations all the time with other tech companies, with nonprofit housing developers, with for-profit housing developers, with the community, with city officials. That's exactly what we're doing. And we're going to continue to do that because we're all in this together.
Thank you for having this conversation with us. Thank you all. We are coming up against the end of our time together, though I could talk about housing all night. So thank you to all of our guests, to Molly and Erin, to Jennifer Loving, Rebecca Prozan, Julia Mahowald, Pastor Paul Bains, and Khanh Russo. And I want to invite our whole audience to listen to Sold Out, KQED Sold Out, Rethinking Housing in America. You can get it wherever you find your podcasts. And thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.